Sono molto contenta di essere qui a presentare Eric Kluitenberg perché curatore, ricercatore indipendente, adesso ricercatore all'Istituto of Network Culture di Amsterdam. È un autore di diversi saggi relativi prevalentemente su quello che in Italia viene trattato o di solito etichettato come mediativismo o tactical media, e in Italia ha sicuramente questo tipo di argomenti, ha una storia di esperienze abbastanza importanti, come per esempio ricordiamo Individia Italia, Work Meeting o altre esperienze molto importanti all'interno dei movimenti italiani. E nei giorni d'oggi, in questi mesi, in questi anni più che altro, abbiamo visto un enorme cambiamento di tutto quello che è il panorama del mediativismo, e nei libri di Eric si pongono proprio quelle che sono le domande che vengono poste prevalentemente all'interno sia dell'ambito attivista che dell'ambito artistico legato all'attivismo. Non voglio anticipare troppo rispetto a quello che poi sarà quello che ci dirà Eric, e lascio poi alla parte successiva, quella delle domande, alcune stimolazioni rispetto a quella che poi potrebbe essere anche l'esperienza italiana e rispetto a quelle che ci mostrerà Eric. Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Just to add to the notes that you so kindly introduced, there's a little booklet that came out end of 2011 called Legacies of Tactical Media, which was published by the Institute of Network Cultures, where I'm currently in a very pleasant position for a year as a researcher in residence or research fellow, so saved from precarity for 1 year, but as of the 1st of January I'm really back at the bottom. And this booklet, I took a few copies with me if you're interested. It explores some of these wider contexts and histories of this thing called tactical media and relates it to the present situation in 2011. And of course, then all these momentous events, these popular protests erupted, and it erupted really in the middle of writing this little booklet. So for me, it was also somewhat unexpected to see this string of events, to which I now refer in brackets as the movements of the squares, this kind of very large, massive popular protest movements that occupied especially public urban spaces, to use them as a platform for all kinds of political demands and to express dissent. But there was also a very strong media dimension to all these protests at the same time, and I thought this combination is quite interesting. My talk today builds on this, because a lot of the phenomena that I was witnessing in 2011 I could really not explain from conventional political theories or from theories about social movements as they had existed before. It felt that the situations in which these things were emerging were so diverse and so heterogeneous. If you think back to Tunisia and Cairo, they were somehow presenting a first model, even though Iran, with the so-called Green Revolution that never happened, provided already something of a template. Then we saw all the anti-precarity movements in Southern Europe emerging in Italy. Italian activists literally went to Tunis to express their solidarity. We had the 15M and other movements in Spain that famously took over Campo del Sol. we had the Syntagma Square occupations in Athens, and then it moved to the United States, became Occupy Wall Street, and then spread throughout the United States, moved back again into another type of Occupy events in Northern Europe. And to me, just all these different spaces, all these different contexts, all these very different issues that were put on the agenda were very difficult to capture in some kind of, simple political formula of what was going on. There was a certain complexity to the situation that needed to be understood on a different level than the levels where we normally start to analyze political movements. I call this with the subtext the feelings in the air, but notes on political formation in hybrid space. And hybrid space refers very much about this layering of embodied physical spaces and media flows within those spaces. Still one space, but composed of very hybrid elements, and I will say some more towards the end about this specific thing that for which this concept hybrid space is very useful. So to start this off, I want to just do 3 slides with key arguments of where my current research actually is also going and which I'm reflecting on in this talk. So I mentioned already, I use this term movements of the squares in brackets, and I use it very much as a temporary placeholder, just to have a name so that we can refer to something, but not suggesting that this is a coherent phenomenon as such. That there are even such things as movements, because that would be my most fundamental question. Are there movements at all? And I really have a very big doubt about that. So rather I use this term to tease out the heterogeneity of this phenomenon and to then interrogate the connective patterns, because the reality of the massive mobilizations that happened throughout 2011 and afterwards also, and quite recently again in Brazil, for instance, and we saw similar patterns emerge out of a very small-scale riot or protest, I must say, in the Gezi Park in Istanbul, which then exploded into a national outrage in Turkey. So it is not a phenomenon that is really confined to 2011, but it really became very visible at this point. And there's 2, I think, fundamental characteristics that help us to pinpoint that a bit further. First of all, that within these protests there was a very prominent use of what I would call self-mediating techniques. So people were basically transmitting themselves. They were putting all kinds of messages out, whether it was on social media platforms, whether they were uploading videos of events to places like YouTube, Vimeo, and other kind of massive media platforms, but also sending out massively SMSs, sending out emails, just using all kinds of different media channels and platforms, essentially just what was available or accessible. There's a very beautiful example where they opened a telephone line in Egypt, and people who did not have access to the internet could just phone in anonymously and basically make a self-produced recording of what they thought was wrong in the country, in the political situation at that moment, just by phoning in. So this was a very specific use of a non-internet based platform. And then there was this recurrent pattern of public urban space occupations, and most visibly in occupying central urban squares. Therefore, this movement could be called, or this phenomenon could be called, the movements of the squares. Now, interestingly, the placeless nature of internet-based platform played a crucial role in initial mobilizations of these protests. That was rather clear. A lot of things were coordinated over the internet, and people got to know about it first via all kinds of internet-based feeds, so that played quite an important role. But then immediately this urban public space acts as an embodied place of encounter and face-to-face exchange. And this double nature was very interesting, but it was even more interesting that once people went into that public space itself, because of the proliferation of wireless media platforms and mobile media, it was itself was deeply saturated by these kind of mobile and wireless media, and it started to act also as a media space in itself. People were immediately sending tweets out from the streets, sending SMSs, or just taking videos quickly, then go to the next point where you have an internet connection and upload it to the internet. So maybe not real time, but there was this sort of sense of using public urban space as a kind of media platform. And this resulted in a kind of double presence of the people who were on the street, the protesters. They were both physically embodied immediately there, interacting with each other, and at the same time, and almost real time, they would also be present in the media space, and this media space would be potentially have a global reach. One of the really interesting experiences with Occupy Wall Street, for instance, was that when the eviction started to happen, activists actually created live streams of the eviction. So I witnessed one eviction, I think in Oakland, live on the internet, and it's a very chaotic image that you get, but it's a really interesting kind of dynamic that people are physically there in a space, and that at the same time this space is a almost placeless media platform. And another thing that started to emerge very much from this situation was that these internet platforms ensured what could be called a translocal multiplication of what happened locally. And this is something that had been theorized by sociologist Saskia Sassen for quite a long time, that increasingly people in local spaces who have a local concern or action can connect via these media networks very directly, almost in real time, to other groups in other localities and create connections between them, so that a local action also can become a translocal action very quickly, and that the local therefore achieves a new scale. It becomes it starts to operate on multiple scales. So Sassen calls it the local as multi-scalar, and we saw that very much in this in these protest movements in 2011. People started to exchange manuals, people started to exchange experiences, they made solidarity statements, they coordinated actions on certain dates, and so on. So we saw that the local was no longer tied to one particular place, but it was actually multiplying across the map, and it bypassed all the traditional forms of international hierarchy. So you get a new kind of political formation that starts to emerge that completely bypasses the traditional vertical hierarchies of local government going to national government, going to international government, and finally to global bodies. Here there was a much more immediate mobilization between all these different spaces across vast terrains. Now, I mentioned already that these media forms deployed in the movements of the squares were primarily self-produced, and therefore they were also primarily non-professional. So these were not media professionals who were transmitting these events. This was just ordinary people who were putting their pictures on Flickr, whatever. the essential point is that it's a non-professional that takes center stage. And this raises a fundamental question about the subjectivity of the protesters that were active in these spaces. So who is this individual who is uploading these images, and what is also the self-conception of this person, and how does he or she position herself, himself in this situation? There's this question is quite unavoidable because of the nature of the media production that happened here, this self-produced non-professional. But then when you accept this notion of subjectivity of the protester, you also have to acknowledge that subjective experience is not just guided by consciously articulated aims, and not even only by consciously articulated emotions, because you can have emotions in these kind of dramatic moments, and of course there were very strong emotions, but the emotions are still very much conscious. There are, at the same time, all kinds of very powerful non-conscious flows of what I would call affective intensity that flow in these situations between the protesters and across both these physical encounters, but also across the media links that are produced in these situations. And I've been trying to find a way of capturing this, and the best approach that I found was the work of the Canadian philosopher Brian Massumi, who has done fundamental work on pinpointing this notion of affect, and there's actually a whole field now emerging called affect theory, which deals primarily with the way how the body, just the physical body, reacts to stimuli from the environment. So it's very basic. And Massumi found out that there is actually a whole domain of interaction that we can discover as soon as we move beyond that which is happening within consciousness. So there is a non-conscious interaction which is very much guided by the physicality of the body. So this is not something ephemeral, it's not floating in the air, it's very basic, it's very embodied, very direct, and he calls this thing affect, or affective intensity. And it turns out that if you adopt this perspective of Massumi and start to apply it to what happened in these movements, a lot of things that didn't seem to make sense at first suddenly seem to make a lot more sense looking through this perspective. Now, if we accept these kind of non-conscious flows to play an important role in these gatherings, this enormously expands the range and complexity of potential interactions that can happen and the associations that result from that between different people. If experience, for me, was captured beautifully in in many of these images, but this one captured me in particular. This is from a special issue of Shahadat, which collected these kind of self-produced images mostly. Around the initial Tahrir Square occupations, and this guy, this is a photo that was available on Flickr. I think the photographer is known in this case, but this guy is not known, he's just somebody on the streets, and he has written on his face, "Free people." And I thought that was really interesting, that he uses his face as a medium, so he is transmitting himself as a protester rather than as just a citizen with this statement, "free people." So these are freed people, freed from oppression, people who are now finally free to speak. At least there was this idea, this moment when the fear of repression was transcended in these protests. But there was a second aspect in this picture that captured me, and that is the look in his eyes. I called it the gaze. I wrote about it also a little bit in this network notebook. This gaze in these eyes, where are these eyes actually looking? I was wondering when I saw this picture, and it's not just this guy, I saw this in a lot of pictures, this kind of totally overexcited gaze. And it was a kind of gaze into infinity. He's not really looking at anything in particular. It seems that this guy is in this moment of intense protest. This intensity of that moment also is driven beyond his normal state of being, so beyond something that can still be consciously articulated. And I think this beyond, this gaze into infinity, was exactly a pointer into a direction where we should look. I wanted to show first a little visualization. Just to get an idea, these are Twitter exchanges being visualized. I click a bit through it to do it a bit quicker. In the run-up to the 15M square occupation of Campo del Sol in Madrid, the big Spanish anti-precarity protest, and you see that this kind of flow of messages intensifying over the days running up to the events. And of course, Madrid is one of the central nodes in this network. And what I liked very much was that it somehow reflected the kind of interaction that starts to happen when people start to exchange messages around the topics that are related directly to the core of the protest as it was staged in Madrid. So, by looking not at the content of these messages, but rather at just the flow of interaction, we can get a picture of the kind of interactions that can be shaped by these kind of network media. And in this case, it's only Twitter exchanges. One of the reasons why you often see Twitter visualizations is that the back end of Twitter is open, so the researchers can easily access the data of Twitter streams. So it's a very popular research method. But it shows something of this intensity of exchange. And this intensity of exchange was really enormous. So we saw here only a little fragment. And we know that around different kinds of gatherings, there is an excess of message exchanges to such an extent that we can see that really what is exchanged in the message doesn't seem as crucial as just the act of sending it and the experience of receiving it. So this kind of interaction, the exchange, seems to be far more crucial here than the actual content of these messages. Also, one thing that I think is very significant is when people with their mobile phones are in these squares and they're constantly getting these updates about what is happening in other spaces, in these other localities, especially if protests are staged in multiple cities at the same time, or they get feedback from their friends or other things. They get these sensations, even very physical, of the mobile phone humming when another SMS is coming in. And if this is continuously happening, it creates what I call this feedback loop of the excitement of the event being heightened by this continuous flow of messages. And then this excitement results, of course, in them sending out messages themselves from the streets as quickly as possible to share what is going on, or to share the excitement, which builds again with others who receives these messages. So we have this continuous kind of feedback loop happening, particularly as a result of the massive presence of these wireless and mobile media. This kind of linking I would call the affective link between these protesters in the street, and I wrote here, it doesn't reside so much in the message conveyed, but it is much rather coextensive with this linking. So the affective impulse is created really through establishing the link much more than anything that is said through this link. Now, within these kind of situations, the body of the protester becomes a really crucial thing to look at. It is the point at which all these experiences come together and are temporarily united. And the question is all the time for me, how can you make this flow of these kind of energies that are operating somehow outside of our conscious registration, how can you make that clear? And I think one of the ways in making it clear is through listening at it, listening to affect. And one of the rituals where this effect was particularly strong was in the ritual of the human mic, which was famously used extensively in the Occupy gatherings in the United States, but also in many other places, where a speaker would speak in very short sentences, and the group would collectively reproduce this short statement. And it would always start with the same thing. It would be this thing, mic check. And then the group would shout back, mic check. And then you know, okay, the group is ready to act as the amplifier of the speaker. And but to make this effect, this presence of the affective really clear, I needed to find an example, a recording of this, which was empty, rather empty of content, because I discovered that this affective dimension is clearest when content is least in the way, when you have an as empty as possible speech. And actually, Slavoj Žižek, the famous philosopher, psychoanalyst from Slovenia, fitted this bill perfectly. Žižek spoke on Čukotty Square on October the 9th in 2011, and he delivers a speech which is virtually entirely empty of content, but very strong in its affective dimension. And what you will notice in the middle, he starts to explain something, and there's actual content coming into the discussion, and you feel the energy going down, but just listen.
Look down.
So the interesting thing in this clip is that when he starts to explain the cartoon in the middle and really needs to sort of conjure up this image, he has to transfer actual information rather than giving these completely hollow statements. And at that point, the group's dynamic starts to go down because everybody's processing information at this point rather than just reacting to this continuous feedback loop that is happening in this group. And of course in a recording and with difficult sound here, you can't hear it that well, but you can in the recording very strongly feel it. And then towards the end when he says, "Hey, you guys in Wall Street, look down," and this kind of really empty statements, then the group, the energy goes up again and people start to react, cheer, and so on. So you feel that there is a almost inverse relation between the content of the speech and the affective dimension of it, and it's the effectiveness of the affectiveness, let's say. And that resonates very perfectly with what Masumi observes about affect. He says affect is semantically open. It doesn't have any kind of semiotic structure. It doesn't connect to meaning. It is just the body reacting to impulses from the environment. And affect can therefore connect all kinds of issues together because it somehow connects to language again that are very heterogeneous. It also in that sense can play a very important role in overcoming all kinds of contradictions. It can connect things that literally contradict each other. And it produces very unexpected links between situations. It also gives rise to what I would call specific linguistic formations. Masumi says affect has a relationship to language, but it's not direct. It's a relation of what he calls resonance. Affect resonates with language. There's particular language that amplifies this affective intensity and other language that actually dampens it. And the more semantically open the language is, so the more hollow the phrase, the better it is suited to amplify affect. We saw that perfectly embodied in the Occupy Wall Street movement in their famous slogan, "We are the 99%, which I would now characterize as the most empty slogan in the history of mankind. It says absolutely nothing. Because just think about what this 99% would mean. It would mean that janitors and brain surgeons and students and all kinds of other people and all kinds of middle classes, religious nuts and liberals, libertarians, all kinds of communists, they would all be the same. They would all be one group, 99%. There's a very vague reference to the fact that wealth is very unevenly distributed in the United States and that 1% captures most of the wealth. But this is a fact that had been known for a very long time and has been addressed publicly also in the United States for many, many years before Occupy Wall Street. So it was not that this introduced an entirely new political point. It just resonated very strongly with some feeling of dissent that was already there, and it amplifies it. In these signs that they are holding up, there's also a beautiful one which says, "Heal America." It doesn't mean anything, but it somehow resonates with the kind of feelings that were already flowing around in these squares. The second point about affect, and this is very fundamental, and Masumi points to it, is the speed of affect. Cognitive psychologists have done all kinds of laboratory experiments where they can measure how quickly a response can be observed towards or after a certain stimulus is released on a test subject. And the conscious response out of all this testing is averaged at about half a second. So it takes about half a second from a stimulus to get to a conscious and outward directed response. Masumi calls this half second the missing half second. So this consciousness requires this half seconds of processing to have a conscious response to a stimulus. But you can measure physically the body reacting much, much faster, on average between 0.2 and 0.3 seconds. And one of the ways that these psychologists measure that is by measuring the changes in galvanic skin resistance. So you can just measure it, and you see that within averaged at 0.25 seconds, there is a response of the body to an image or to some kind of stimulus that is presented to it. And of course, marketeers, advertisers make massively use of that. They test all kinds of campaigns and images and things they put out to see what kind of physical response people have to it even before they have a conscious response to whatever they are presented. And it really helps you to manipulate the perception of people. Interesting thing is that if you average it like this, 0.5 to 0.25 seconds, it would imply that affect moves twice as fast as conscious responses. And therefore you get very complex relationships between how your body is already reacting to all these stimuli that are produced, particularly in these tense and very dense situations, and how your consciousness is actually dealing with these situations. Now, because people feel this intensity, they want to do something with it. And Deborah Gold, she's a sociologist from the United States. She was for a very long time involved in the AIDS activism movement, ACT UP in particular, in the United States. And she noticed that within these movements, there's a very strong tendency to try and understand the intensity that these people feel. They want to articulate basically emotions on the basis of this intensity. And these emotions are basically consciously articulated concepts that attempt to capture this intensity. And they do it traditionally, typically through group processes, which also massively happened in all these occupations where people were having these kind of general assembly type of discussion sessions where they tried to make sense out of the situation and capture it. But the problem with this kind of capturing is that because affect moves much faster and because it responds in all kinds of unpredictable ways to influences out of the environment, this kind of capturing is never perfect. There's always something escaping. And Masumi also observed that. He said emotion is both the most intense expression of the capture of affective intensity and an expression of the fact that something has always and again escaped. So in these kind of tense and dense situations, there's always this affective intensity escaping capture and creating new sources of energy for instability. This is exactly why it is so difficult to control these events on the one hand, but on the other hand to build stable also political formations out of them. I think, at least, and this is my argument. Now, a further issue within this situation is what I've mentioned at the beginning, this notion of hybrid space, that we are not in either a purely embodied and purely local space, nor in a purely mediated and electronically and networked space, but in a space where these are completely fused and intertwined. So very much the interreality that Marlene was talking about, but then in these kind of politically tense situations. Now, hybrid space is a concept that I've been using for quite some years, developed by architect Frans Vogelaar and Elisabeth Sicchiaridi, who run the Hybrid Space Lab in Berlin now, and they're both teaching architecture. Elisabeth is doing architecture, Frans Vogelaar is teaching media design, spatial media design, I should say, at the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne. And they developed this concept of hybrid space to talk about this, this mixture of the physically embodied and the mediated. And for them, spaces are always hybrid. They always consist of these different elements that operate according to different logics. But that coexist in the same space. So they don't want a sort of separate internet space, but they really think about this space as an integrated space which has very different dynamics going on in it at the same time. In this protest situation, most notably the physical encounter and exchange of the people on the street, and the simultaneous media dimension of it, where it exchanged with other localities across an almost unlimited media network. Now, the density of these spaces is continuously shifting. The density is mostly composed, if we think about these media flows, by either the presence or absence of media carrier signals. This is really where a variability starts to emerge. So sometimes you have really fast networks there, sometimes you have a Wi-Fi network locally, sometimes only GSM or even less. And depending on how many of these different signals are present there, how many layers, the density is continuously shifting. And within these situations then, the breakup of connection is just as significant as the presence of these signals. And there's a beautiful example in the background. It's a very famous tweet that was sent out by the Iranian opposition leader Mousavi during the Green Revolution, where he says, all internet and mobile networks are cut. We ask everyone in Tehran to go onto their rooftops and shout Allahu Akbar. So Allah is great. And they did this protest massively. And it was a very significant moment. So the networks can be cut at any moment. Then the density of a hybrid space is decreased dramatically. And then you have to find other ways of communicating that statement, and this example from Iran is very impressive in that sense. Okay, so I want to end with a statement that is more historical from the 80s, from the German and Czech media philosopher Wilhelm Flusser. It's a bit long, but I'll just read it out. And it speaks very well for itself. And it's an absolutely visionary statement about how we can think about these kind of hybridized spaces where these kind of things now really emerged on a massive scale over and over again in these new types of protests. And Wilhelm Flusser wrote in 88, the new image of humanity looks roughly like this. We have to imagine a network of interhuman relations, a field of intersubjective relations. The threads of this web must be conceived as channels through which information, ideas, feelings, intentions, and knowledge flows. So, first of all, the human relationship network of human relationships is literally interpreted here as a communications network. That is very important in the first thing. Just think about this is before the public internet, this is before mobile phones and all these kind of things. So this is at a moment when the kind of formations that we see now were absolutely impossible to imagine. These threads, he writes, get temporarily knotted and form what we call human subjects. So the human subjects are just knots in this in this web of threads. The totality of threads constitutes the concrete life world, and the knots are abstract extrapolations. The density of the webs of interhuman relations differ from place to place within the network. The greater the density, the more concrete the relations. These dense points form wave truths in the field. So here we see this variable density of hybrid space already sensed by Flusser as a result of especially developments in media technology. The wave truths exert an attractive force on the surrounding field, pulling it into their gravitational field, so that more and more interhuman relations are drawn in from the periphery. And this is exactly what we saw, for instance, around the Gezi Park riots. There was a very small protest. It was put down by the police. Media messages started to flow of this police brutality, and that drew in with an attractive force more and more people from the periphery, and ultimately created an enormous national protest for a very long time in Turkey, out of which we still have to see what the political consequences of this is. And he finishes, these wave truths shall be called cities. So cities, in his understanding, are just communication networks. That is also a really interesting way of looking at it. So, on the basis of this, you can start to think about all these, about a system of attractive forces and force fields and relationships that emerge, that start to operate almost entirely outside of the political message, and that start to work on a completely different level. Now, how to translate these back into politics is now the really big question, because we see that after their initial phase, all of these protest movements are running into the difficulty of translating what they achieved in mobilization into concrete politics, and that is a very difficult question. But as a researcher and as a theorist, for me the really interesting step in this, and next steps would be to continue this analysis basically downward in what I would call a Feynmanian motion, after the physicists who founded the field of nanotechnology by going to the ultra small in physics, into what I would call the microstructures of association that constitute the social, so out of which the social emerges. And we may find a field which seems to be bottomless, and in which we can go down and down, to go further and further into these microstructures to understand what is actually happening in the macro world. And this was quoted or paraphrased after Feynman for his famous speech on December the 29th, 1959 at the annual meeting of American Physical Society at the California Institute of Technology, basically the birthplace of nanotechnology, whatever you think of nanotechnology. But I think this analogy is quite interesting also. That's it, what I wanted to say.
Allora, dopo tutta la presentazione è difficile fare un attimo un passo indietro, perché prima di magari partire delle domande più su questo aspetto delle emozioni, delle relazioni tra i soggetti che vivono la piazza, volevo portarti un passo indietro rispetto a quello che è il percorso che hanno fatto i tactical media nel corso degli anni, e anche in Italia c'è stato un grosso movimento che ha portato che viene riassunto bene dalla frase, dallo slogan "Don't hate media, became media". Praticamente questo portava la gente a utilizzare tutti quegli strumenti di informazione posseduti da quella che era l'informazione mainstream per portare una controinformazione all'interno delle proteste. Naturalmente questo aveva un duplice aspetto, tra l'aspetto della materialità, però poi nel corso del tempo ha portato anche ad un approccio come quello che abbiamo visto prima rispetto alla studiare, andare molto più approfonditamente negli strumenti e quindi c'era anche lì una sorta di contraddizione tra il lato di amatorialità e quello di conoscenza e approfondimento professionale quasi. Adesso invece ci troviamo in un panorama completamente diverso che vede poi i singoli soggetti tutti quanti interpreti di questo slogan. Chiunque all'interno delle proteste può mandare un tweet, scattare una foto, fare un video, diffonderlo su internet in tempo reale però anche qui c'è sia un aspetto di positività, perché questo porta alla conoscenza di determinate situazioni, ma anche una sorta di rischio, perché dall'altra parte c'è un problema per le persone coinvolte o comunque rispetto alla privacy, oltre al fatto che si tratta di social network centralizzati. Quindi diciamo che ci troviamo di fronte a un panorama completamente diverso. Volevo chiedere come quella contraddizione della materialità, come la vedi all'interno di questa idea dello spazio ibrido e se ancora è valida come tipo di argomentazione o comunque come argomento su cui poter discutere e ragionare.
The duality of what exactly? The duality of what exactly?
About the amatoriality and the materiality of the social network and it's centralized.
On the issue of traceability of people who express themselves in those kind of media platforms, the answer is quite clear. They are ultimately traceable, especially if you post on platforms like Facebook, totally traceable. So that is not really advisable for if you are facing a very severe form of repression from authorities. There is that's a very obvious and clear point. The counter strategy to that from activists has for a long time, I think, been to deliberately bring this dissent into the public realm and just take the risk, as it were, in order that this transparency, this openness protects them to some extent. The problem is that now that we get this multiplication of people who are uploading and transmitting, it's no longer smaller groups of activists who are very conscious about the political stance that they take and also about probably the risk that they take in doing this. We get a completely other communicative situation, which is only very partially determined by clear political strategies. So a lot of people participated in these protests because they somehow felt compelled to leave their house, to not sit behind their little laptop anymore, to move into the street. and then wants industry to retransmit this excitement of the moment. So you get a completely other type of situation, which the question is whether authorities are really that interested in these individual protesters. They are probably more interested in the people who stage and organize and choreograph protests. The problem for me is much more the idea of what kind of consequences we should draw from this enormously expanded presence in the media space of just ordinary and non-professional media producers. And my feeling, as I've tried to show here, is that there are so many other types of energies that are flowing around here, that things are being brought together that cannot be reduced anymore to a singular political strategy. So it's very unclear what these people are actually in the streets for, besides this joining in the excitement of the moment. And I think that a lot of the activist groups who were active, who did have a political strategy in mind, they ran into the problem that they were staging these events for a particular reason, and they were, of course, very happy with the massive mobilizations they were able to bring about. But because of the nature of these mobilizations, and because of the nature of this extreme complexity of feedback loops that we are envisioning here, it could then not be turned into a politically effective response. And we've seen that, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood took over a well-established strategic political force that immediately took matters in their own hand. And when further protests emerged against the Muslim Brotherhood, it was used for a military coup. In the United States, Occupy Wall Street dissolved without any visible results so far on the way that politics is conducted in the United States. In Spain, the election victory of the center-right sort of moved even further away from where the protesters were going. And I was also talking and presenting in Athens, and activists there also had this feeling like, okay, so we did these massive mobilizations, but how can we turn this into an effective political strategy forward? And this is where I see now the big challenge lying, more than in the traceability of people who took part in the protests.